The night was supposed to be calm, the kind of quiet you only get in the suburbs when even the crickets seem tired. But that peace didn't last long. Out of nowhere, an explosion of brightness blasted from Mr. Harold's porch, so powerful it looked like the gates of the sky had swung wide open. The glow stretched across the clouds, making it feel like sunrise had shown up 12 hours too early. Neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, squinting and muttering under their breath, while wondering if they now lived across from a lighthouse. Even the stray cats froze on the sidewalk, unsure whether to keep moving or bow to this new artificial daylight. And there he was, Mr. Harold himself, sitting calmly in his old rocking chair, sipping iced tea as if he had planned the whole scene. He looked like a man who knew exactly the kind of trouble he was stirring up. The first victim of this late-night sunrise was, of course, Linda. She stormed out of her front door in a silky nightgown, nearly tripping over her lawn gnome, phone in hand like it was a weapon. To shield herself, she wore giant sunglasses, yes, at midnight, because Harold's porch lights had turned her carefully trimmed yard into something that resembled a Broadway stage. "This is ridiculous," she yelled, her voice bouncing through the cul-de-sac. "This is not Times Square. This is a residential street." Across the road, Mr. Watson wandered out in his slippers, shading his face, while a couple walking their dogs stopped dead, staring as though an alien spaceship had landed. And right on cue, a police car cruised by. The officer leaned halfway out his window, puzzled, tapping his watch. "It's the middle of the night," he muttered into his radio. "But it looks like daytime on this block. Either I'm losing it, or someone's powering a football stadium." Harold raised his glass with a grin, waving lazily at the officer, clearly enjoying himself. Meanwhile, Linda stomped across the street, her heels clicking like drumbeats. "You've crossed the line this time," she snapped, adjusting her sunglasses as they slipped down her nose. "Do you realize how many community rules you're breaking? There are limits, curfews, ordinances." Harold didn't say a word at first. He just took another long sip of tea, letting the ice clink in the glass before leaning forward. Then, in a low but steady voice, loud enough for every ear on the block, he said, "Linda, you think this is bright? You haven't seen anything yet." With a sly grin, he placed his hand on a small switch box beside his chair. Suddenly, the entire neighborhood held its breath. Linda gasped, clutching her robe as if a bomb was about to go off. Kids whispered from their porches, "What's he gonna do?" Even the officer leaned forward in his seat. Harold's hand hovered, his smile growing wider. For a long moment, suspense hung over the block. Then, he nudged the switch halfway before snapping it back up, teasing the crowd like a fisherman playing with his catch. "Not tonight," he said with a wink. "But soon." Gasps echoed through the street, half in disbelief, half in fear. The declaration was clear: Harold had just started a war. And poor Linda, standing there in her midnight shades, red-faced and furious, was going to be his first target. That night, she didn't get a wink of sleep. No matter how hard she tried, blackout curtains, an eye mask, even piling pillows over her head, nothing could block out the glow that seeped into her home. By sunrise, she staggered outside with messy hair, gripping a cup of cold coffee like a survivor of battle. And before she even brushed her teeth, before she fed her cat, before she changed her robe, she stormed straight to the HOA office and slammed down a thick complaint. Across the top in bold letters, she scrawled, "A crime against the night." The HOA clerk, a young guy barely 2 weeks into the job, tried to stay calm as Linda unleashed her fury. "Do you even understand?" she ranted. "Being blinded by industrial floodlights when all I want is to dream about Tuscany? My cat hasn't stopped pacing, my begonias think it's spring, and I, Linda Carter, the backbone of this community, demand action." The clerk scribbled notes furiously, not because he cared, but because he was terrified she might actually explode if he didn't look busy. Meanwhile, across the street, neighbors were beginning to whisper among themselves. And not everyone was on Linda's side. Mrs. Martinez, who'd been struggling for years to grow vegetables in her shady backyard, woke up to find her tomato plant suddenly thriving overnight. This light, she whispered, touching the glowing leaves, might actually be a blessing. This is unbelievable, Mrs. Martinez said at breakfast, holding up a shiny red tomato. We could open a veggie stand with these. Her husband just chuckled, happily chewing on one straight off the vine at 7 in the morning, completely unaware that his sun-grown snack had actually ripened in the middle of the night. Then there was Danny, a college kid who worked late shifts at the gas station. For him, Harold's lights were a blessing. I don't even need a flashlight to get home anymore, he bragged to his buddies. It's like my own private stadium. Even Mr. Watson had grown fond of it. His dog no longer barked at shadows, because, well, there weren't any shadows left. But not everyone was pleased. Mrs. Turner, further down the street, claimed her chickens had gone crazy, laying eggs at random hours like broken vending machines. Another neighbor complained her smartwatch kept buzzing at 2 a.m., insisting she stand up and stretch because it thought she was out walking under the sun. Still, while a handful of people grumbled, most either laughed it off or secretly enjoyed the strange perks. Linda, however, was convinced everyone was silently miserable, and that she alone had the courage to fight back against Harold's blinding rain. That very afternoon, she called for an emergency neighborhood watch meeting in her driveway. She set up folding chairs, clipboards, and an oversized jug of iced tea. But only 3 people showed: Mrs. Turner, her teenage son who was clearly just there for the chips, and a man named Greg, who admitted he came by mistake. He thought it was a yard sale. Still, Linda charged ahead with her speech, waving around a binder stuffed with local regulations. Article 8, Section 4, she declared, slamming her finger onto the page, clearly states that outdoor lighting must not exceed a reasonable level or disturb the peace of residents. Now, do those lights look reasonable to you? She pointed dramatically toward Harold's house, which even in daylight still gleamed like a glowing temple. But her tiny audience wasn't impressed. Mrs. Turner kept ranting about her chickens, the teenager stayed glued to his phone, and Greg just wanted to know if she had any lawn tools for sale. Linda realized right then, if she wanted to win this battle, she couldn't rely on uninterested neighbors. She'd have to take her fight straight to the top. So she doubled down. She filed another official complaint, requested a property inspection, and even threatened to hire an environmental lawyer over light pollution. That night, as she hammered out angry emails on her laptop, her entire living room glowed as if it were high noon. Her cat perched on the windowsill, staring hypnotically at Harold's porch. Across the street, Harold sat in his rocking chair, sipping tea with the same relaxed smile as always. At one point, he even lifted his hand in a slow wave. Like he knew exactly what she was doing and found it amusing. Linda's jaw tightened. Enjoy it while it lasts, she hissed under her breath. Tomorrow, Harold, the HOA will put an end to this. But a small crack of doubt crept in. Because no matter how many rules she quoted or complaints she filed, Harold didn't look nervous in the slightest. If anything, he looked like he wanted her to complain, like he was daring her to push harder. And that thought kept her awake longer than his lights ever did. By the next evening, the whole block was buzzing with anticipation. Kids whispered on the sidewalks, neighbors sat outside in lawn chairs, and cars slowed to a crawl just to get a glimpse. Even people from the next street had come over, drawn by the rumors. Some whispered that Harold had built a secret fireworks display. Others swore he was setting up a carnival. One dramatic teenager muttered that the government might mistake it for an alien invasion. And there was Harold, sitting like a master of ceremonies. Dressed in his favorite flannel, rocking gently, sipping his tea, as if nothing unusual was about to happen. But the sharp-eyed noticed the details, the wires trailing along the fence, odd boxes hidden in the shrubs, and the metallic glimmer of a disco ball tucked under the roof. Linda saw it all. She stood ready in her driveway, armed with a clipboard, giant sunglasses, and even noise-canceling headphones. Though the sun had already set, she looked every bit like a general preparing for battle. At exactly 9 p.m., the first switch flipped. A faint hum rippled through the air, making the crowd uneasy. Then, snap, the floodlights blazed to life. The street lit up so intensely, it looked like daylight had crashed into midnight. Every shadow disappeared. Street lamps became useless under the blinding white glare. Gasps broke out. A little kid shouted, "It's like morning." A teenager muttered from under his hoodie, "Dude, I think I'm getting a tan." And sure enough, the same police officer from before rolled up again, squinting into the glow and mumbling into his radio, "Yeah, it's happening again." But Harold wasn't finished. The second switch came alive, and suddenly neon tubing flared around his fence, glowing electric blue and pink like beating veins. His mailbox shined in a shocking green. And across his garage door, huge red letters lit up, blazing the words, "Welcome to the show." The crowd erupted, cheers, laughter, applause, like they had just bought front row seats to the wildest performance in town. The crowd reacted like they had front row tickets to the wildest show in town. Someone even dragged out a bag of popcorn. And then there was Linda. She screeched like she'd just witnessed a felony. "This is against the law. It's some kind of outlaw rave," she shouted, clutching her clipboard like a shield. That's when Harold pulled the third switch. A disco ball slowly lowered from under the porch roof, spinning as beams of light scattered across rooftops, driveways, and parked cars. For a moment, the quiet neighborhood looked more like downtown Times Square. Kids squealed with joy, chasing the shimmering dots across the pavement. One neighbor rolled out a lounge chair and stretched like he was sunbathing under the artificial glow. And in one of the strangest moments of the night, Mr. Watson fired up his grill and roasted marshmallows without needing a flashlight. "Best s'mores I've ever made," he announced proudly, handing one to a wide-eyed kid who looked like he'd stumbled into a carnival. The madness only escalated. Birds in the trees began chirping confusedly, convinced morning had arrived. A rooster crowed until it gave up in sheer exhaustion, plopping down on the fence in defeat. One woman marched out with sunscreen and a beach chair, muttering, "Might as well catch some vitamin D while it lasts." Meanwhile, Linda stomped in circles, barking at anyone who dared smile. "Stop cheering. This is an outrage. Do you people want to live inside a circus?" she snapped, pointing at the glowing neon fence. Almost on cue, Harold leaned forward in his rocking chair, his smirk wide. "Linda," he called out loud enough for all to hear, "this is just the beginning." He reached for the last switch, the one nobody had spotted tucked behind his shed. The whole street went still. Linda froze, wide-eyed behind her oversized sunglasses. Even the fire truck that had just arrived, lights flashing but sirens silent, stopped mid-roll as the firefighters climbed out. And then Harold threw the lever. With a spark, the lights synced to a rhythm. The ground vibrated with a low bass thump as hidden speakers around the porch came alive. Suddenly, the blinding floodlights pulsed perfectly to the beat of Elvis Presley's Jailhouse Rock. The disco ball spun faster, tossing silver bursts across the homes. Neon strips along the fence rippled in waves, chasing the music like a living heartbeat. It was no longer just a glow. It was a full-scale light and sound spectacle. The crowd roared with laughter and applause. Children danced in the street, teenagers whipped out their phones to record, and even the firefighters, who'd shown up expecting a hazard, found themselves nodding to the beat. One even clapped along. Linda, however, was in complete meltdown. "This is madness. This is lawlessness. This is Las Vegas on my doorstep," she shrieked, stomping her foot like a toddler denied candy. But the worst part for her wasn't the lights or the music. It was her neighbors, her own neighbors, cheering Harold on. Mrs. Martinez, the tomato gardener, was handing out fresh salsa made from her midnight harvest. Danny, the college kid, was teaching younger kids dance moves under the strobe lights. Even Greg, the guy who thought her meeting was a yard sale, was yelling, "This is the best night this neighborhood has ever had." Furious, Linda tried to storm across the street to pull the plug herself. But as she reached Harold's lawn, the speakers suddenly blared louder, and her own voice echoed out. "I hate fun. I hate fun. I hate fun." The crowd howled with laughter. Harold had secretly recorded her earlier rant and looped it into the music as a prank. Linda froze in horror, her face turning beet red, before spinning around and fleeing back into her house. The spectacle only grew louder and brighter as the night went on. Kids danced, neighbors laughed, and the firefighters leaned against their truck, enjoying the absurdity of it all. Harold, meanwhile, stayed perfectly calm. He rocked in his chair, sipping lemonade, and when the playlist shifted from Elvis to Johnny Cash, he raised his glass in a toast toward the firefighters. With a sly grin, he simply said, "Showtime." Harold wasn't the kind of man to let insults slide. Mischief had always been his way, from tying bells to the neighbor's cat when he was 12 to slipping a whoopee cushion under the mayor's chair back in '85. So when Linda marched to his porch waving her binder of rules, ranting about ordinances and curfews, Harold didn't hear a complaint. He heard a challenge. And Harold never backed down from a challenge, especially from the same woman who once tried to ban his garden gnomes for being too silly. The very next morning, while Linda fired off angry follow-up emails to the HOA, Harold was already in his garage with the door cracked open, whistling a tune as he dug through his old toolboxes. Extension cords, wires, and dusty light fixtures clattered onto the bench. His eyes gleamed with only one intention, escalation. If they thought the porch lights were bright, he muttered to himself like a mad scientist, just wait till they see the deluxe version. The first step was calling in backup. Harold flipped open his ancient cell phone, it still had a frog ringtone, and dialed his old pals from the Veterans Hall. Within an hour, a crew of retirees gathered around his garage, nodding along as Harold outlined his illumination plan. Earl, a retired electrician, offered up 6 industrial floodlights left over from his warehouse days. Could light up a football stadium, he boasted. Benny, who once worked stage crew for a rock band, rolled in with a crate labeled concert gear, packed with strobe lights, neon tubing, and the crown jewel of the box. The light strobed in perfect time, bouncing off the glittering disco ball like it was 1977. Kids who had never heard of the Bee Gees found themselves clapping and jumping in rhythm, while their parents, who hadn't danced in years, tapped their feet on the sidewalk with guilty smiles. Before long, someone dragged out a cooler of sodas, another neighbor rolled out a grill, and suddenly the cul-de-sac had transformed into the wildest block party the suburb had ever seen. Grandpa stood at the center of it all, hands on his hips, nodding to the beat like the maestro of mayhem. Earl worked the makeshift DJ booth with an old laptop, while Benny operated the light switches like he was commanding a spaceship. Neon tubes lit up in rainbow waves along the fence, and every time the disco ball spun, it sprayed glittering shards of light across rooftops, mailboxes, and even Karen's horrified face as she stormed into the street. "This is a violation of everything," she shrieked, waving her clipboard like a sword. "Noise violations, light pollution, illegal assembly. I'll have you all fined." But her words were drowned out when the speakers blasted into Gloria Gaynor's "I Will Survive." The timing was so perfect, the entire crowd roared with laughter, singing the chorus right back at her. Even Officer Miller, who rolled up in his patrol car with his lights flashing, cracked a grin. He stepped out, shook his head, and after a moment of hesitation, started clapping along. Karen gasped like she'd been betrayed. "You're supposed to uphold the law." Officer Miller shrugged, shuffling his feet to the beat. "Far as I see, ma'am, the only law breakin' here is folks having too much fun." The party only grew louder. People danced in the street, kids twirled glow sticks someone had pulled from a closet, and old Mrs. Delgado surprised everyone by doing the hustle like she'd been waiting 40 years for this night. Grandpa even handed out lemonade refills like it was festival punch. Karen, however, was not about to give up. She stomped back to her house, slammed the door, and within minutes returned with a giant extension cord. Muttering furiously, she plugged it in, marched toward Grandpa's yard, and made a grab for the outlet powering the lights. But Grandpa had been expecting her. Just as her hand reached for the cord, the music shifted into another one bites the dust. The crowd howled, and the lights flared in dazzling sync, forcing Karen to stumble back, shielding her eyes. She tripped over her own garden hose, landing squarely in her begonias while the disco ball sent a spotlight directly onto her like she was the evening's unwilling performer. The crowd erupted in laughter, clapping and chanting, "Dance, Karen, dance." Red-faced, she scrambled up and fled back inside, slamming her shutters tight. But even from her living room, the thumping bass and the neighborhood's laughter rattled her windows until midnight. At last, when the final song faded and the disco ball spun to a stop, Grandpa eased back into his rocking chair with a long, satisfied sigh. Neighbors thanked him, kids begged for an encore, and Officer Miller raised his soda can in salute. Grandpa just smiled, tipped his hat, and said, "Sometimes the best way to fight darkness is with a little light." And with that, the neighborhood legend of Disco Grandpa was born, a story folks would retell for years, each time with a little more glitter, a little more music, and always the same ending. Karen never quite recovered from the night she lost the battle of the lights. The firemen, who had shown up ready to shut things down, leaned against their truck instead, nodding to the beat. One even grabbed a glow stick from a teenager and twirled it in the air like he'd been waiting his whole career for this moment. And then Grandpa did the unthinkable. The crowd erupted in laughter, clapping and chanting, "Dance, Karen, dance." Red-faced, she scrambled up and fled back inside, slamming her shutters tight. But even from her living room, the thumping bass and the neighborhood's laughter rattled her windows until midnight. At last, when the final song faded and the disco ball spun to a stop, Grandpa eased back into his rocking chair with a long, satisfied sigh. Neighbors thanked him, kids begged for an encore, and Officer Miller raised his soda can in salute. Grandpa just smiled, tipped his hat, and said, "Sometimes the best way to fight darkness is with a little light." And with that, the neighborhood legend of Disco Grandpa was born, a story folks would retell for years, each time with a little more glitter, a little more music, and always the same ending. Karen never quite recovered from the night she lost the battle of the lights. The firemen, who had shown up ready to shut things down, leaned against their truck instead, nodding to the beat. One even grabbed a glow stick from a teenager and twirled it in the air like he'd been waiting his whole career for this moment. And then Grandpa did the unthinkable. He rose from his rocking chair. For months, the neighbors had only seen him planted there, sipping lemonade, muttering about squirrels, never moving more than a few steps. But tonight, he was different. He reached into a wooden crate, pulled out a cowboy hat, and tipped it to the crowd with the flair of a showman. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed into a microphone wired to his porch. "Welcome to the first annual neighborhood block party." The street erupted in cheers. Karen nearly dropped her clipboard. She stumbled into the road, waving it like a sword. "Block party! Block party! This is a violation of every HOA rule in existence. There's no permit, no approval, no." But her tirade was drowned out as Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire blasted through the speakers. Right on cue, neon flames danced along the fence, glowing red and orange like a carnival fire show. Somebody dragged out a barbecue grill. Within minutes, the street smelled of burgers and hot dogs. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were suddenly laughing together. Mrs. Delgado set up a table with salsa and chips from her midnight tomatoes. The Hendersons rolled out coolers of soda and water. Tim, the college kid, wired his laptop into Grandpa's sound system, mixing classics with modern hits. Children dashed across the glowing street, their shadows spinning under the disco ball like playful ghosts. Karen stormed through the crowd, scribbling names furiously on her clipboard, shouting about fines and violations. But the problem was, nobody cared. Not anymore. When she tried to unplug the stereo, kids formed a protective circle around it, chanting, "Dance! Dance! Dance!" When she demanded the firemen shut everything down, one just laughed. "Lady, we're off the clock. And honestly, this is the best call we've had all week." The cul-de-sac, once filled with petty arguments over lawn length and recycling bins, had transformed into something magical, a community. And Karen, poor Karen, was falling apart. She stood in the middle of the chaos, hair wild, sunglasses askew, shrieking into the void. "This is the end of this neighborhood. You're all sheep, sheep." Right then, the disco ball spotlight landed on her, making it look like she was performing. Phones shot up to record. Someone shouted, "Karen's finally dancing." Laughter exploded through the crowd. Grandpa leaned into the mic, his voice booming. "Don't worry, folks. This isn't a one-time thing. This neighborhood deserves a little light, a little fun, a little life." The cheers shook the street. "Grandpa! Grandpa! Grandpa!" Karen stomped her foot so hard her sandal snapped. She stormed back to her house, slamming the door, but her voice carried through the walls as she screeched into her phone. "HOA, get down here now. He's turned the neighborhood into a circus. Into Vegas." The neighbors raised their glow sticks and sodas in a toast, laughing until their sides hurt. For the first time in years, it felt like they were truly a community. But behind her closed curtains, Karen wasn't done. She was already plotting her counterattack. And Grandpa, rocking back and forth in his chair with a smug grin, knew it. He wasn't worried. Because this was only the beginning, and he still had plenty of tricks up his sleeve. By the following week, Karen had taken her fight straight to the HOA board. "Grandpa's porch isn't a light show, it's an abomination. People could mistake our neighborhood for a runway," she barked, slamming her clipboard on the table. Jim, a weary board member, pinched the bridge of his nose. "Karen, with all due respect, it looked like everyone was having a good time. Even my wife went, and she hasn't smiled since the 90s. Another board member added with a grin, "Honestly, it boosted community morale. We had neighbors talking to each other for the first time in years." Morale? Karen's jaw dropped. This isn't about morale. This is about rules, order, civilization. But her outrage fizzled. Half the board had already been caught on camera waving glow sticks at Grandpa's party. They weren't about to punish the man who made them feel 20 years younger. Humiliated but not defeated, Karen escalated. That night, dressed head to toe in black like some clumsy ninja, she crept across Grandpa's lawn with a pair of wire cutters. Her ponytail bounced with each step as she muttered, "If the board won't act, I will." She spotted the web of extension cord snaking into Grandpa's shed and crouched low. One snip and it's all over. But Grandpa was ready. The second her cutters clamped down, a hidden speaker above her head roared to life, blasting a looped recording of her own voice, ripped straight from one of her HOA rants. "I hate fun. I hate fun. I hate fun." The words echoed across the block. Porch lights snapped on. Curtains parted. Neighbors peeked out, giggling, phones already recording. "There she is," someone shouted. "The anti-fun police." Karen froze in the spotlight, cutters still in her hand, looking like a villain caught mid-heist. Laughter erupted as phones captured every angle. With a shriek, she dropped the cutters and bolted back to her house. But by morning, it was too late. The video was everywhere, TikTok, Instagram, even the local news. "Karen hates fun," confirmed, read one viral caption. Kids remixed her voice into songs. The news anchor chuckled through the segment while a goofy sound effect played in the background. Karen nearly fainted watching it. But she wasn't done. If sabotage failed, she'd bring in the law. She phoned the city inspector's office, demanding a full investigation. Within a day, 2 inspectors arrived, clipboards, hard hats, the works. Karen hovered behind them like a vulture, convinced Grandpa's empire of lights was about to collapse. But after a long inspection, the lead inspector shook Grandpa's hand. "Outstanding setup, sir. Fully up to code. Solar-powered, eco-friendly, frankly, impressive." "Solar-powered?" Karen screeched. The inspector raised an eyebrow. "Actually, ma'am, the city encourages sustainable energy. He's well within his rights. You should be proud, this might be the brightest, greenest block in town." The neighbors roared with applause. Karen, red-faced, was forced to watch as Grandpa was praised like a local hero. At the next HOA meeting, even the board turned on her. "Karen, enough is enough," Jim said firmly. "You've wasted hours of our time. The truth is, this neighborhood loves the lights. They've done more to bring people together than all your clipboards and fines combined." Another board member added, "Frankly, you've filed more complaints this month than we've had in the last year. At this point, you're the disruption, not Grandpa." It was the ultimate betrayal. Karen, the self-proclaimed guardian of order, was officially the villain. The neighbors mocked her openly. Someone even painted a sign in their yard that read, "Fun zone ahead." By the end of the week, Karen was unraveling. She yelled at kids for laughing too loudly, scolded the mailman for delivering junk mail with too much enthusiasm, and even accused Mrs. Delgado's tomatoes of growing suspiciously under Grandpa's lights. Meanwhile, Grandpa just rocked on his porch, sipping lemonade. Whenever Karen glared from across the street, he'd raise his glass in a mock toast. The war was over. Grandpa had won. Or so it seemed. Because Grandpa wasn't content with just victory, he wanted style. And the finale he had planned would be the kind of twist no one, not even Karen, could possibly see coming. Friday night arrived, and the neighborhood gathered once again, buzzing with anticipation. Lawn chairs lined the sidewalks, kids waved glow sticks, and music pulsed faintly from Grandpa's porch. Everyone knew something special was coming. Grandpa had been too quiet all week, tinkering in his shed. Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, clipboard clutched like a sword. She had made her final calls, filed every complaint possible, and tonight she was certain the city would shut it all down. But when the clock struck 8, it wasn't inspectors who arrived. It was a convoy of food trucks, rolling down the street with sizzling grills and flashing neon menus. Behind them came a local band setting up amps, followed by a mobile stage that unfolded right in front of Grandpa's house. Grandpa stepped forward in his lawn chair, lifted his glass of lemonade, and the lights erupted, this time not just his porch, but the entire block lit up in perfect synchronization. Houses glowed rainbow colors, every roofline pulsed to the beat of the music, and the disco ball now spun high above the street on a rig he'd secretly built. The crowd went wild. Neighbors danced, kids chased beams of colored light, and even the mayor showed up, laughing as he accepted a plate of barbecue. Karen stormed into the street, screaming over the music. "This is illegal. This is chaos. This is a rave." But her voice was swallowed by the cheers. Phones recorded her every flailing gesture, every furious stomp. A chant began to rise from the crowd. "Karen hates fun. Karen hates fun." She spun around, desperate for backup, but the HOA board members were dancing. The city inspectors were eating tacos. Even the police cruiser that rolled by just gave a quick honk and flashed its lights in rhythm with the music before moving on. Grandpa leaned back in his chair, smiling as Karen's rage hit its peak. Then, with a dramatic wave of his hand, the music dipped, the lights dimmed, and a single spotlight snapped onto Karen. The screen behind the band flickered on, playing a montage of her greatest meltdowns, shaking her clipboard, yelling at kids, sneaking with wire cutters, set perfectly to the beat of "Stayin' Alive." The block roared with laughter. Karen's face turned crimson. She dropped her clipboard, screamed, and bolted into her house, slamming the door so hard a porch light rattled loose. The music surged again, louder than ever, as fireworks shot into the sky. Grandpa raised his lemonade in a toast. To the neighborhood. The crowd echoed him, raising cups, glow sticks, and plates of food. The night became a festival, the street alive with color, sound, and joy. And from her darkened window, Karen could only watch as the block she tried so hard to control danced without her. Grandpa had won, not just the battle, but the heart of the entire neighborhood.